Hello, it's good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school lesson. And this week we continue on in the story arc of David. And we will be taking a look at several different spots from 1 Samuel 17, which is the story many of us are familiar with. It's one of those very constant stories that show up throughout the cycles of Sunday school literature, I guess would be a way of describing it, as goes the story of David and Goliath, that everyone from preschoolers up through obvious experienced adults have heard time and time again. So with that, we should be aware there is always the challenge to come into this story with a sense of familiarity, which causes a bit of a glazing over of the eyes, a dullness of the ears, to want to see and to hear new things. Of course, we should always be leery of trying to just mine something that's new out of any passage of the Bible for the simple sake of finding something new. But we should always be coming to any passage of Scripture with an open mind, a humble heart, recognizing that we are learning from the teacher, not me, but obviously the Lord, as we engage him with the help of the Holy Spirit in his word. That doesn't necessarily mean we do not or should not rely on outside helps for the sake of clarity. Sometimes that might be necessary. But of course, if we are exercising proper practice, as goes biblical hermeneutics, which in and of itself takes some degree of training outside of the Bible to help us appreciate all the many things that go into the compilation and composition of the Bible itself, that practice will help us be able to rely a little less on those outside helps and more so on focusing on the text. But we do that always with the sense of respect of what the author intended this story to mean, because the story of David and Goliath, especially in modern times, I can't necessarily say that this has been an ancient practice or a medieval practice, but certainly within more recent and modern times, this story has kind of been broadcast in such a way that people come away from the story with a sense of how this applies to them, as if they put themselves in the driver's seat, so to speak, and trying to see how David's formidable challenge, as goes defeating this foe, is something that we might perhaps experience in an everyday pattern of living, trying to live out the truth of who we are in Christ, as goes our faith, recognizing that we are new creatures in Christ, but we, of course, continue to live in this world, and by virtue of that are going to face spiritual obstacles, which certainly may come in many different forms. All that to simply say, anyone who teaches this lesson or preaches this in a sermon format that presents this information in such a way that it's as if you can put yourself in David's shoes and you will slay the giant that stands before you, whatever obstacle that might be, in faith, as David slew Goliath in faith, that is what you are supposed to take from that. I would argue that that is not even a layer of meaning of the many layers of meaning that can be seen or peeled back in this story, because that is not proper biblical hermeneutical practice. I hope that doesn't turn you off to listening to what else I have to say, as goes the remainder of this lesson. But all that to just simply point us to the fact that familiarity can sometimes be our enemy. It works against us. We have to wrestle against that sense of complacency to listen to what the Spirit has to say as we pray and invoke him when we are studying either corporately, like we will be here together, even though we're doing this kind of on an individual basis and at an individualized pace, but it's still somewhat corporate, certainly in a physical corporate setting. But even when we do this privately, as goes devotional practice and disciplinary habit, we should still be reading for the sake of what is the author trying to communicate to me, as goes why this story is where it is, how it flows from what's come before it and feeds into what will come after this. Okay, so we're going to read these passages, and then we're going to take an approach both this week and next week, because next week we're going to jump ahead to 2 Samuel 7, that spot when David receives the covenant blessing of the Lord. And then one final lesson on David in 2 Samuel 11, when he experiences his moment of falling with Bathsheba, and then what he does to Uriah. So Our approach is going to be paralleling this with what has happened previously with Saul, and all of this, of course, backing up to the prologal material that starts the book of Samuel for us. And that, of course, is Hannah's story, the conception of Samuel, and how Hannah came to praise and exalt the name of the Lord, giving us that 10-verse psalm in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and how that culminates, as we've referenced several times before, in the words of verse 10, awaiting the arrival of God's anointed one, his king, the one he will give power to, the one whose horn he will ultimately exalt. So we're going to look at their stories in tandem because the author points out several points of similarity to create a sense of parallel between them and to help us understand how David is marching in the same line that Saul was before Saul deviated from that path, okay? And how that portrays Saul after the moment of his crescendo in the story, the defeating of his enemy, Nahash, and then, of course, David with multiple enemies that he defeats before he winds up surrendering to his vice and, well, just say lack of virtue in that moment, okay? So let's dive into this without me gilding the lily any further. 1 Samuel 17, beginning in verse 16. Every morning and every evening for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. One day, Jesse had told his son David, take this half bushel of roasted grain, along with these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. When he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the men, or Israelite men, saw Goliath, they retreated from him, terrified. I've mentioned this before, but in case you've forgotten or you're just tuning in for the first time, these little series of dots here are to illustrate the changes in verses up here at the top left corner of the screen. So we've already read through 22 to 24. Now we are moving to 32 through 40. And when you see the next 3-line grouping, that will be verse 45. So David said to Saul, don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. But Saul replied, you can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since he was young. David answered Saul, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. It's quite the tall tale if you think about it, because I'm sure the form that Saul saw in front of him, as goes David, was not something to be particularly impressed by. And certainly even the tallest, most burly, bravest of men and warriors would probably not dare do something so crazy as attempt to try to mangle either a lion or a bear, which would make mincemeat of any man, even the most skilled of warriors, unless that warrior was incredibly cunning with his weapons and had probably faster than normal reflex timing. All that to say, it's easy to think that Saul may have raised an eyebrow at that and thought, yeah, I'm sure this kid's probably not telling the truth. Anyway, your servant has killed lions, bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Then David said, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Then Saul had his own military clothes put on David. He put a bronze helmet on David's head, had him put on armor, and David strapped his sword on over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. He said, I can't walk in these. David said to Saul, I'm not used to them. So David took them off. Instead, he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his pouch, in his shepherd's bag. Then with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. And David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel, who you have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us. When the Philistine started forward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, took out a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword. David ran and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they fled. All right, if you'll join me for a moment of prayer. Lord Jesus, our shepherd, our king, our master, our savior, our friend. Lord, we love you. We exalt your holy name, for yours is the name above all names, at which every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that you are Lord. You rule sovereignly at the right hand of the Father. You govern the nations and all the fates of men. Lord, we are grateful that you have made us part of your covenant family, that you have invited us into your kingdom. You have purified us that we might be kingdom subjects and servants. You have inaugurated your kingdom and allowed us to experience the newness of creation, even though it has not yet come in full, but it has begun with us, and that you have indeed exchanged our hearts of stone for hearts of flesh. You have given your spirit, writing your Torah upon that heart of flesh, and have endued us with the power to be obedient and to walk in the wisdom and light of your counsel. And all of this is a pack of blessings that we in no way, shape, or form could ever merit to earn or maintain. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what it is that you've done. And I pray, Father, that you would please open our eyes to this oh so familiar lesson. Help us to appreciate it for what it means. Set us on the right foundation so that when we look to this story today, and of course later in the future, as we intend to read the Bible multiple times beyond this, that we may start from the right point, and that you will help lead us further into the truth by showing us even deeper levels of complexity and meaning that we may not see or capture here today. We ask this in your name, Lord, that you would challenge our faith and help us, Lord, to be more pleasing to you as servants, that you be glorified in all things. Amen. So David, the serpent smasher, it should go without saying that the intent of the author, of course, is to paint David in the light of what Hannah has said in her psalm of victory and praise, that the Lord is going to bring a king on the scene. And when he does, he is going to give power to that king because it will be his king. And when he does, he will also give power to that king to judge or bring justice. And he will also exalt the horn or the strength of that king, such that God will ultimately be the one to receive glory, as this covenant partner is going to be ruling in the way that the priest king who was made and planted in the garden, I should rephrase that, made outside the garden, but ultimately planted in the garden to serve as both king and priest, and to fulfill the agenda of expanding the garden to the ultimate extent of the horizon and fill the earth with God's glory and his wisdom, will ultimately do. That king that Hannah speaks about will be the person who brings about the fullness of that experiment that was lost in Eden, but of course has been the carrot at the end of the stick that the narrators and authors of the story up to this point have been chasing, being oh so close to, leaving a breadcrumb trail for us to follow, but always entertaining the tension in the equation, and that is this person that we are about to meet, or the person that we are now discussing and studying, are they the Messiah? Now, with that, for many of us, we are familiar enough with the biblical story to know, of course not. And we so easily attribute many of those messianic prophecies or hints or allusions directly to Jesus. But we have to understand there is not a line being drawn from the mouth of the prophet and the words that were dropped in real space and time and then eventually replicated on paper for our preservation. There's not a line that is drawn directly to Jesus. There is a line that is strung through many people, not as fulfillments in the sense that we think of Jesus as a complete and total fulfillment. I want to refrain from using the term partial fulfillment because it creates all these different questions and connotations, as goes prophecies and whatnot and eschatology. But I would rather say a suspect, a person who is a potential candidate to fulfill this role. But we see through the arc of their story, with a rise and a fall that is common to all of them, that the question is asked, the prospect is given, the potential is seen, but ultimately the fall of that character answers the question definitively that no, they are not the ultimate serpent smasher that is alluded to in the Genesis prologue, or at least chapter 3 of that story, when the serpent enters the scene. So these are all things we're going to explore a little further, right? So anyway, in verses 4 through 6 of this chapter, which if you noted, we started, I think, around verse 16. So there's several verses that we have yet to actually cover. And there are parts of that section of the narrative that are tremendously important for us to discuss so that we can appreciate the context of David fighting Goliath, all right? So we know that, of course, there's this massive Philistine who comes out and just intimidates every one of the Israelites who stand and look at this man and have been for 40 days now when David finally comes back to the battlefront. Now, we know from the story he has been going back and forth from Saul, because remember, at the end of 16, he has been enlisted into Saul's service because of this evil spirit that comes upon him and troubles him. He starts causing issues, as goes Saul. Saul starts causing issues within his home. Maybe we can call it a palace of some sort that he is ruling from when he's not out on battle campaigns against the Philistines or whoever he is raging against at the time. And this evil spirit causes him to act out in ways that no doubt are very troublesome, such that advisors have entreated Saul, asking him maybe he might want to find somebody who can play a musical instrument that would soothe this evil spirit and cause it not to trouble him so. And that, of course, is how David enters into the mix for us, as goes him and Saul crossing paths. So maybe that's what David is doing, running back and forth between the Israelite camp and, of course, the pasture where he keeps his father's sheep to feed those sheep. So David is not just sauntering into the camp for the first time at the time when he comes to deliver this package of provisions and goods for his brothers who have been enlisted in the army and, of course, are fighting with Saul in his ranks and their combatant commander. All right. Anyway, so we know that story, but let's appreciate some of the finer details that the author has left for us to glean from. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall and wore a bronze belt. Notice I'm highlighting bronze, and a bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. And there was bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze javelin was slung between his shoulders. And he will go on to speak about how there are a few aspects of his entire ensemble that are iron in nature, but there is a reason here, perhaps, why the author has made it a point to tell us that the Philistine is completely clad, nearly head to toe, in bronze armor. And that I do not think is just to simply highlight the fact that Goliath was alive at the very tail end, the twilight on into the evening dusk hours of the Bronze Age, giving way now to the Iron Age, by which greater, more formidable weapons were being forged, and ultimately iron armor, at least that kind that can be worn by both man and beast, will ultimately be forged as well. It's not to include that level of detail for us, just for us to simply pick up on the fact this is the era of history that we find our story situated in. This detail in Hebrew would definitely have drawn the attention of the reader, considering, as I've said before many times, the way that Hebrew words, usually working off either a 2 or more commonly 3-letter base pair that may have other letters inserted between those 3-letter base pair letters. Let me say that in a way that might not be so confusing. Other letters that might be inserted between the letters that form the 3-letter base pair union. They would understand the connection between many of these words and how the author is not playing fast or loose with the word, but in every way is playing off a word that has previously established significance. I'll dive into that here in just a second, okay? All that to simply say, over in Genesis chapter 3, we start to find the first point of connection here that creates for us the suspense that David is the one who not only is the candidate that could potentially fulfill Hannah's words in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10 as the Lord's king, but of course that in and of itself carries with it massive connotations from the story all the way back in the Genesis prologue that has been advanced forward up until this point. We are waiting for the character who will fulfill the role of Genesis 3:15, the man who will come from the woman, who represents the head of the seed of the woman, who will ultimately do battle with the seed of the serpent and will crush the head of the serpent, even though he himself will suffer a wound in the process. So David is standing now in the center of the stage with the light directly upon him as we evaluate him extensively, appreciating everything that he does, says, even the things that we are privy to with respect to his thought process. We get a way more of that than we ever do with Saul or other kings, considering we get to peer into David's mind and heart through and by the means of his words that become Psalms. All that to say, in chapter 3, verse 1 of Genesis, we have the word serpent. The serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals. He, of course, is the one who begins to entice the woman, questioning the words of the Lord. But here's where our connection is built in for us. Because when we have the Hebrew word here, nehoshet, and of course, this other Hebrew word over here that represents serpent, they don't seem to have an awful lot of commonality. But when you appreciate the when you stop to appreciate the N, the H, and the S, this is the three-letter Hebrew base pairing that we start to pick up on with respect to this letter, and this letter. So here we have those letters for us, here, here, and here. I'm going to erase that just so that we can see that a little better, okay? So here, here, and here. We see those exact same three letters. So what does that connotate here? That means there is a very close textual connection that a native Hebrew reader or speaker will be able to pick up on, even though the two words serpent and bronze are drastically different for us in the English language, but a gap is closed between the two in Hebrew. And we talked at length about this when we were discussing the events in Genesis chapter 3 and the prospect of whether or not this is actually meant to be seen as a serpent or a snake, what any of us could step on when traipsing through our garden or just our yard at this time of the year, or was the entity in Genesis chapter 3 actually a spiritual being that came to be referenced as a serpent, but based off the original Hebrew word of nakash, which could mean shiny thing or shining one, was perhaps a better descriptive term to illustrate the way that the man and the woman saw the serpentine being. And I say serpentine only in the sense that it's serpentine by virtue of the way that a snake might act and the way we think of a snake if we were to personify it in some way, of being very sneakish, and of course intimidates and causes fear within many of us when we wind up seeing it, because we automatically assume it must be up to no good. It is in every way intent on attacking us. There is a much deeper conversation by which volumes of books and articles have been written over that describe and discuss the concept of the connection here between the snake and spirit being in Genesis 3. And I would urge you to go back and look at that archived lesson from several months ago. But all that to simply say, we have to appreciate there is a connection between the two. Now, when we consider the idea that there is the use of this word that is so close to serpent in Genesis chapter 3, used 4 times in just the first few verses we have of 1 Samuel 16, it really begins to create for us an understanding here that Goliath is something of a serpent figure that has entered into the story for us. And certainly, considering the other connections, that the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 is the existential threat to God's people, who right now are just the base pair of Adam and Eve, the original king, queen, priest that God has planted in the garden and begins the Eden experiment with. Israel is the corporate Adam in that God has redubbed them with that mantle of responsibility and, of course, this mission that they are supposed to accomplish. And now that they are in the land that God has planted them in, per the words of Moses in Exodus 15 and the victory psalm over the Egyptians that God has defeated through the crashing in of the Red Sea on their heads and whatnot, that now we have an existential threat that for 40 straight days has defied the God of Israel, making fun of him, making fun of his people, and intends in every way to do what the serpent was doing in the garden, which was to enslave the pair of image bearers, the king and queen priests, to their own passions, their own desires, and a world where they thought they could rule without God and basically harness their own authority over themselves and everything that God has placed underneath them. This Philistine doesn't want to enslave them to their own passions. He wants to enslave them like a new Pharaoh, basically, over them, like Pharaoh in Egypt did after Joseph died and was out of the picture. So Goliath wants to make these people his slaves perpetually. With that in mind, we know what has happened in previous stories, what God has pronounced over the serpent in the garden, what God did over the serpentine king in Egypt, who attempted to oppress and was successful at it for quite some time, the Israelites, up until the time where God heard their cry and came to redeem and deliver them by crushing the serpent. We're actually going to allude back to that here in just a minute. But there is another point of connection here. When we go to Numbers chapter 21, verse 9, when Moses made the bronze snake in the wilderness and mounted it on a pole, God never told him to make the serpent of bronze. Moses, for some reason, chose to do that. We don't know what exactly that was, but notice here when we appreciate the word serpent here, we have two words set right beside each other that are so very close. It's almost hard to not see the connection between them when we appreciate the three-letter base pairing between them. So again, bronze and serpent going hand in hand with each other. Now, another stronger point of connection here is in verse 5, which we've already read, that he wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor. This is important because while we are going to have to borrow here from text that will come centuries in the future, I think there perhaps, as other scholars have noted, a point of connection in that Ezekiel may very well be alluding back to this particular story in 1 Samuel and the story that transpired in the book of Exodus in the first 14 chapters with respect to Pharaoh at the time and how he, as the existential threat against God's people, threatening the covenant people of God, was the one that God judged and ultimately made spoil of. Ezekiel in his day, as he is pronouncing curses on all of the nations that surround Israel and whose time has come as they are ripe for judgment, God is looking to use the tool of Babylon, who of course is going to punish the tiny kingdom of Judah, and Ezekiel has made that a prominent point of much of his prophecy, is also going to punish other nations, Egypt being one of them. But notice how this kind of somewhat political satire in the form of prophecy is being lauded against Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Ezekiel said, look, I'm against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster lying in the Nile. I highlight that because the Hebrew word this comes from is tamim, which in most contexts is translated serpent. It's translated serpent in, I think it's Exodus chapter 8, when we have Moses standing, or Moses and Aaron standing before Pharaoh, and to repeat the sign that was demonstrated by the Lord to Moses when he was in front of the burning bush, and Moses was kind of seeking some validation, as goes, what do I say to validate that you are indeed the one sending me? God said, you see what's in your hand, throw it down, it becomes a serpent. There it is called a nakash. But later on in the context of Exodus chapter 8, when Aaron and Moses are in front of Pharaoh and he casts down his stick and it becomes a serpent, the Hebrew word serpent there in Exodus 8 is actually tamim. It is not nakash. And of course, tamim is the word we have as great monster lying in the middle of his Nile here in Exodus 29, describing Pharaoh. And it's not coincidence that tamim is used in Exodus as the picture of the serpent from the staff right there in front of Pharaoh, who is, again, the great monster who is seeking to maintain his oppressive and domineering tyrannical grip over and around Israel. The same can be said here with respect to the Pharaoh, who is the picture of, or the target of God's judgment, being pictured as this tamim in Ezekiel chapter 29. So he goes on to say, who says, my Nile is my own, I made it for myself. God says, I will put hooks in your jaws and make the fish of your streams cling to your scales. So here the word we have that's translated for us bronze scale armor, or perhaps a more literal translation from the Masoretic text. And if you're not familiar with what the Masoretic text is, I won't take this time to help you understand that. I would just simply say that's a Google search waiting for you, and you will come to an easy understanding of it by reading probably the number one search result you find, because it's a standardized meaning. But nonetheless, the term there comes from this Hebrew word, kaskasim, but we have the exact same root base over here with respect to the word scales being used in Ezekiel. I'm sorry, I'm highlighting the wrong part. Right there. So here it's translated as a coat of mail or bronze scale armor in 1 Samuel 5, but in Ezekiel 29, the same word is used to describe the scaly appearance of this great serpentine tamim creature that is listed here as great monster. Again, a metaphorical way of representing Pharaoh, who was king over Egypt. And of course, he's got that snake figurine on top of his crown, but all that to simply say, as this story in Ezekiel 29 or prophecy is alluding to what happened in the events of 1 Samuel 17, and the idea that Goliath, this enemy, is seen there standing before the people in bronze scale armor that represents the same kind of scale pattern that you would see either on fish or densely packed scales that you would see on a snake. It's meant to connote for us the idea that yet again, there is one more piece of information that's to clue us in that Goliath is standing firmly as the serpent figure of this story, right? He says, I will haul you up from the middle of your Nile. All the fish in your streams will cling to your scales. Now back to the story in 1 Samuel 14. I'm sorry, that should be 17:46. David goes on to say, today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, remove your head, give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. And if we just go back to Ezekiel 29, notice here we have another connection, because this is the only other place we actually have this configuration of this phrase here of handing flesh over for the consumption of the birds of the sky, or consumption by the birds of the sky. When Ezekiel goes on to say of this tamim creature, this great monster who is metaphorically referenced to Pharaoh, I have given you to the wild creatures of the earth and to the birds of the sky as food. So yet again, another allusion here to the story back in 1 Samuel chapter 17. So what I'm trying to say here is, here we have the mention many times over of the bronze and shiny appearance of Goliath, and that, as goes the Hebrew word for bronze and serpent, are so close in connection that the two are meant to be seen as an interplay, one off of the other, in just about every context you notice between them. Our first clue that Goliath is the serpent figure, another one being the way that the story is alluded to and by the author of Ezekiel in Ezekiel 29, describing Pharaoh of Egypt, but yet using context clues that help us understand Pharaoh is being pictured as a serpent, and a serpentine creature who is more like a twisting sea serpent of sorts, writhing around, flopping around in his Nile that he thinks he made for himself. He is going to become the target of God's judgment, and God speaks about how his pattern looks like scales. This is the pattern of Goliath's armor, and ultimately, this figure is going to be hauled up out of the army by hooks, dragged out onto the land where he cannot survive, and as he dies, his flesh will be handed over to be consumed by the birds of prey of the sky. The same here was what was uttered by David when he said, the Lord is going to give you to me. I will kill you and your army behind you, and all of you lying open and or naked and exposed on the battlefield will have your flesh picked off your bones by the birds of the air. Moving on to verse 26 of 1 Samuel 17, David spoke to the men who were standing with him. He asks, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? So just who is it, this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? Notice here, we've seen words very similar to this in previous places where, again, we have something of an existential threat, coming against God's people. And that is in the book of Joshua. Now, the existential threat is not quite in the same vein as you see with either the serpent in the garden, where he is right there in their midst, even though he is not seeking to attack them overtly by biting them and envenomating them with his poison, or like Goliath, who was standing in front of them, daring them to come out and fight him, but in every way intends to kill them, not to simply entice them through subtle hints or phrases or whatever the case might be to do something that is disobediently rebellious. No, we don't have that in Joshua. But what we do have is the formidable enemies that lie on the western side of the Jordan that they are about to cross. And then they do by Joshua chapter 5. And while they're there, they're already in enemy territory, but God causes them to take pause. And before they actually begin the process of conquest, they first have to deal with the business of all the men not being properly circumcised and thereby not in right covenant relationship and standing with their God. And then, of course, to observe Passover and whatnot. But once these men are circumcised, God says, I have rolled away the disgrace of Egypt from you today. Now, how does that connect back to 1 Samuel 17? Well, first of all, it was the fact that these men were disgraced by virtue of the fact they're not in proper covenant standing with the Lord by observing the covenant sign that God gave to Abraham, in that all the males have to be circumcised. And notice how David couples this when he speaks about how this Philistine is uncircumcised. By virtue of that, he is not part of covenant Israel. He's not in right covenant standing with God. And through that identification, he is a subject or target of God's judgment because he is part of the nations, and the nations lie outside of the grace of God's covenant with Israel, at least at this time. Israel has a mandate to the nations, but certainly God is not done dealing with those nations who have continued to serve as threats against Israel. And Philistines, or I should say Philistia, has been the most dominant and long-standing threat now for several generations against God's people, spanning all the way back to the time of even Samson, right? So anyway, the disgrace here that is the issue, of course, in 1 Samuel 17 is that this uncircumcised Philistine stands so defiantly against the ranks of Israel, and not a single man amongst the armies of Israel would dare go down into the valley floor and challenge this man. No man has the assumption or belief that God is going to deliver this Philistine into their hands. Forget what has happened in yesteryears with respect to the resounding victories that God had performed through his people and the defeat of giants. If we consider the peoples of the Rephaim, the Nephilim, that peopled various areas like Bashan and the kingdom of Sihon and Amorite territory and whatnot, and with the felling of all of those enemies, they should have remembered that, hey, God has made us giant killers in the past. But they seemingly forget this for the sake of, in fear, and out of fear of their own lives. And because of this, they continue to cower in their own ranks and refuse to go out and meet the demands of this man. So this has brought great disgrace and reproach upon Israel because no one wants to partner or align themselves with God, except for David. Now, Joshua has a whole entire nation of people who are aligned with him and are ready for the agenda that God has before them to go and to conquer. But you'll see how the attitude of the people standing to David's rear, once he is facing the Philistine, changes quite quickly once the battle goes in favor of David and the Philistine giant is dead. So we have a connection now between David and Joshua. We've pointed some of those out already, but of course, many of those connections lie in the future from this point of the story in 1 Samuel. I only pointed those out for the sake of covering textual ground that we won't get to in other lessons. But here's yet one more point that connects David to Joshua, and that David is something of a new Joshua figure who is bringing Exodus, at least the idea that Joshua is the leader who is finishing the Exodus by bringing the people into the land, conquering it, resting them in the land as God intended, so that they can launch the Eden experiment all over again with the extinguishing of the Canaanite tribes. So David is working to extinguish Philistia and the threat against them, and ultimately subdue all of Israel's enemies so the land can have rest, like Joshua was the agent that brought rest with the Lord's hand and help. And then ultimately the Eden experiment can resume and begin to flourish once again, right? Another one would be back in 1 Samuel 17, verse 32, where David said to Saul, don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And it's Joshua who was told by the Lord, haven't I commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Here Joshua is receiving that edification by the Lord. Look, Joshua, I'm with you. Don't be afraid. You have nothing to worry about. Everything that you need has already been given to you, and I have assured you in all the ways that you need that I am with you. Here David is telling the king, who is supposed to be the one sitting over Israel, leading them into battle, going out before them to fight, leading them back into the land once victory has been had. He's telling this king, don't be afraid. Let no man within the army be discouraged by him. I will go and I will fight him. So yet again, another Joshua connection. Now on to verse 38 of 1 Samuel 17. Then Saul had his own military clothes put on David, and he put a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor, which we perhaps can presume might be at least leather in nature, though no description is given to us. It is plausible. It could be bronze, because obviously if Saul could afford to have a bronze helmet made, why not bronze armor? And another thing to add to that would be, we are told throughout the story arc of Saul that at this point, only himself and his oldest son, Jonathan, actually could afford to have iron weapons cast for them. And of course, in the plural, that would seem to suggest that there was more here than just either a simple spear or a sword, but multiple weapons that contained iron components. So again, if money was there to afford such things, not knowing where exactly they wound up getting them from, since the kingdom of Philistia had outlawed that practice and virtually restricted the trade in such a way that it was almost impossible for any Israelite to actually come into the possession of iron and then have it smelted and turn into weapons or even simple farming utensils. So not knowing where they got it from someplace. And with all that in mind, we're able to have proper fighting weapons to stand up against the Philistines. But the important thing is, with respect to this, is that as David strapped on his sword over the military clothes and he tries to walk, he is restricted by this armor. And considering there's a textual connection now between Saul's armor and the armor of the Philistine, which the armor of the Philistine clearly paints him as the serpent figure. And here we have Saul, who has been rejected as king because of his flagrant disrespectful rebellion against the Lord by what he did in 1 Samuel 13 and 15. And the kingdom has been stripped from him, at least in the figurative sense, and has now been passed on to David, awaiting for the time the Lord dispatches Saul, removes him from the equation to then install David as the rightful king. That if Saul is the rejected figure, and not only that, but of course is going to become, as Samuel painted the picture of in 1 Samuel 8, something of a tyrannical, Pharaoh-like king over the people, then he is going to slowly slip into the position of being a serpentine figure himself. And certainly he will act this way as he opposes God's people in more than one way. Not only the anointed King David, but ultimately the priestly family that he slaughters because they assisted David, many of the other people that he is conscripting into his army, all for the sake of hunting David and all of his known associates down and whatnot. And with all of this, he is certainly acting as an existential threat against God's people and his anointed one, which firmly puts him on the side of the seed of the serpent and not the seed of the woman. But as David rejects these clothes, saying, I can't walk in them, and he takes them off, we see clearly that David is not being cast in that light, and he is becoming the antithesis to the serpent figure, which in some ways does play off of the events of what happened in Genesis chapter 3, with the idea of the image bearers succumbing to the temptation offered by the serpent. But David here is not choosing to do that. David here is making the proper choice, which is not to rely on the armor itself, which would perhaps have covered more body surface on David than it would Saul, making perhaps David just a little less vulnerable to direct blows. But chances are it probably wouldn't have done him much good, because if he couldn't effectively wield a weapon with it, and we can presume that since it's David's sword that is strapped over the armor, maybe he carries his own sword, maybe not. Maybe by his sword, it's to be understood that it's Saul's, but he has taken temporary ownership or possession of it for the sake of using it with the armor, and that he chose to reject it all. Maybe he didn't strap his sword back on him or a sword back on himself, when he went out facing the Philistine armorless and only with the aid of a sling and stone. Either way, the point is that he is rejecting the offer of the serpentine figure here, because in many ways, Saul will become a giant. He is a giant, but he will become a giant much like the Philistine is, that being Goliath, later on in the story, the closer he gets to the point of his ultimate demise, right? So anyway, moving forward. Verse 49, 1 Samuel 17, David puts his hand in the bag, took out a stone, slung it, hit the Philistine on his forehead. Now, odd as this may sound, there is some debate as to whether or not he may have struck him in the shin. And you might wonder, how in the world can that be? It is said more than once that he was struck in the forehead. It seems impossible to render that as shin, but there are other manuscripts outside of the Bible, of course, that are not canonical. Thereby, they are not considered divinely inspired works, and they should not be brought on par with Scripture. But as far as works of antiquity goes, they do perhaps bring some measure of light into this enigma. And the question is raised, why do some of those documents seem to preserve this tradition that is contemporary to the time of David striking the Philistine on the shin rather than on his forehead? You know, there's several points of debate that I'm not going to go into with respect to this, but it is somewhat curious that when we read this and we consider that if you and I were struck in the forehead with a massive rock, that we probably would not fall forward. We probably would fall backward. Now, that's a point of semantics, I guess, and just the simple fact that what does it matter how a person falls? And if a person was struck in the forehead but kind of dallied there for a second while they're waning in and out of consciousness because he doesn't seem to be dead at this moment. The narrative goes on to say that when David drew the Philistine sword, he killed him, then he cut off his head. So I'm not even sure exactly how he killed him, maybe stabbed him in the chest, whatever the case might be. But the Philistine fell down to the ground, seemingly on his front side, or his front side laying down on the ground, which would be, again, a curious way for a person to fall after being struck in the forehead as opposed to the back of the head with a stone. And if he was indeed struck very forcibly in the shin, that currently or subsequently disabled him from being able to stand up straight, fell down, and David was quick enough to be able to go and draw the Philistine sword before he could, and then kill him with it. And of course, immediately after, cut off his head. Well, why does this matter? Because I'm going to bring a couple of things to light here in just a second, as goes a point of connection with Daniel 2. I'm not one who advocates either way. It doesn't matter. He was hit on the body somewhere, probably his forehead, that caused him to fall forward. And ultimately, we know the mechanism by which he does die. But we remember here, earlier on in the story of 1 Samuel, before David was ever born, there was a time back in the days of Eli and Samuel as a young boy, that we have another battle with the Philistines, and the Israelites wind up losing the ark. And when that happens, God sends himself into exile by allowing the ark to be captured and carted off into exile. And the ark itself is placed in the temple of Dagon. And on the second day of it being there, after the statue of Dagon had fallen down, lying prostrate before the ark of the Lord, now the second day, the statue has fallen again prostrate, but the head has fallen off and the hands had fallen off. So that, in a lot of ways, is suggestively foreshadowing the events of what would happen here as the outcome of this battle. That now the champion of Dagon, who is the chief of the pantheon of the Philistines, is out there on the battlefield, beating his chest, shouting up into the open air at the God of the Israelites and all of his soldiers, saying that there's no one who can beat him. He's going to enslave all of Israel and so forth. Dares a man to come out there and fight him. And how this battle ultimately winds up ending is that God subjugates Dagon once again by his champion now receiving this death-wielding blow that causes him to fall down and ultimately lose his head. And so that signals that even though the ark was in exile, God was in exile, he intends to bring about the destruction of the people of the serpent, or the seed of the serpent in this story, and that being the Philistines. He is going to rescue his people from the Philistines as God ultimately comes back to the land when the ark crosses back into Israelite territory. And now David is about to be the figure who is going to bring the ark out of exile within the land and restore it to its proper place in a new house that he will build for it. All of this to signify that, again, a new Exodus, kind of like a Joshua figure here, is on the horizon, that the darker days are going to slowly slip behind them as God is about to bring his king up to the forefront, who is going to usher in a new era, a new age for Israel. And of course, there perhaps is no stronger connection here than back to the text in the Genesis prologue, Genesis 3:15, the promise that there would be enmity between the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman, and of course, the seed of the woman will strike the head of the seed of the serpent. Now, back to 1 Samuel 17, verse 49, he fell face down to the ground. Perhaps this could also be an allusion back to Genesis chapter 3, because before we have the promise of the seed of the woman stomping the head of the seed of the serpent, we are reading the words of the curse that God places on the serpent when he says that on your belly you will eat dust all the days of your life. So you can kind of picture it with the Philistine falling forward now and his face lying in the dirt. And he's, of course, patiently waiting for David to come and finish him off and kill him. He never actually eats dirt, but it's the symbolism there of the serpent figure of this story, the challenger, the existential threat, the one who is defying God and his people in this story, as now being the one who is laying with face in the dirt, about to wind up losing his head. 1 Samuel 17:51, David ran, stood over him, grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from its sheath, used it to kill him. Then he cut off its head. So now, looking at the whole motif itself and how this has worked, from how David slung the stone from the sling, he has caused the Philistine to become incapacitated and ultimately has defeated him by killing him, cutting off his head. If we look forward to the story of Daniel, again, about 500 years in the future, when Daniel is an exile now, but serving in the court of the evil Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar has had this dream that has troubled him, like Pharaoh in Egypt. And he is unlike Pharaoh, who is just simply mildly inquiring of all of the people who would be considered magi or wise men and could offer up occultic meaning for and significance for the dream that he has had. Pharaoh is all too willing to describe his dream, whereas Nebuchadnezzar demands both the dream and its meaning. As Daniel is brought forward as the one whom God can use to do this, he speaks to him and he says, as you were watching, a stone broke off without a hand touching it. And of course, we recognize that David did not take time chiseling out stones to try to hone them in such a way that they would do the job he intended for them. Rather, he simply went to the brook and he chose smooth stones, which were not touched by the hands of men or shaped and molded by the hands of men. And back to Daniel, the stone itself struck the statue on its feet of iron and fired clay, which, if there is an allusion back to the story of David, perhaps there might be some validity here to the idea that David struck Goliath in the shin first before the final death-wielding blow. That's just a point of academia. Again, there's really not much in the text that is meant to be clung to there as a point of dogma, by no means. But what can clearly be seen as a connection between these two here is as that stone strikes the feet of iron and clay, which is a rather peculiar place to strike this Colossus image. And the reason why I say that is, granted, if the feet are struck and they lose structural integrity, then the weight of the statue itself would cause the statue to come crumbling down. But what is described here by David recounting Nebuchadnezzar's dream to him is he says that this statue was basically almost ground to powder and blew away, such that not a single trace of it was left behind, only the stone that then grows up to be a massive mountain. So when he says he crushed them, man, he really means it, ground it into powder. And all that to say, a curious spot to hit both the statue and the Philistine, but to bring about the ultimate destruction of both of them. But if you think about it, Colossus image is meant to bear out the idea of an intimidating and imposing, towering figure. And as that figure represents a succession of both kingdoms and superior to inferior metals and mediums that were made to create this statue, it all represents the existential threat of the nations that will continue to rule over Israel, because the Babylonians are the first to do so, considering the captivity of the kingdom of Judah, which is really the more important part, I guess, of the Israelite kingdoms considering the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes that had already been taken off into exile. But after Babylon is done, there won't be a restoration of Israel in the fullest sense of that. There will be something of a restoration in that the people will be released to go back to their homelands when the Persians take over, but the Persians will continue to be their overlords until their successors, the Greek kingdoms of Alexander, take over, and then ultimately their successors, the Romans, wind up subjugating Israel. So all that to simply say, as Goliath here is an uncircumcised Philistine and represents the nations, and of course the serpent, so will every one of these successive kingdoms from Babylon on to Rome will all represent the serpent in those stories, and of course the existential threat against God's people. So all that to simply say, I think there is something of a very strong textual connection between the imposing figure of the 9-foot plus tall giant of Goliath, and of course the massive colossal image, both representing the nations as the existential threat against God's people, and how they were both destroyed. Back to the story of 1 Samuel in 34 through 36, David answered Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came, carried off the lamb." We know the rest of this. David claims that by the hand of the Lord, he was given power to kill lions and bears with his bare hands. Notice how later on, Daniel is going to have a recapitulation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, albeit in a different way with different entities, because instead of a colossal image, he will now see 4 successive creatures come waltzing up out of the sea. And the first of those is a lion, and the second of those is a bear. Now, why does this matter? Again, it's curious how when David is speaking to Saul and he is trying to reassure him that he is not as inexperienced as Saul might think as a shepherd, he didn't just simply smack coyotes or other types of smaller predatory creatures on the head with his shepherd's staff to try to drive them away, but certainly the kind of animals that would have perhaps been a fatal encounter for an ordinary person, unlike David, who was endowed by God's Spirit in those moments to fight against these massive predators, lions and bears, and then deliver those creatures into David's hands that he might kill them. So we have, of all the creatures on land and sky, and perhaps sea as well, since that's where they come up out of, to represent the nations, as Goliath represents the nations, that these creatures that Daniel sees that represents the nations, the first 2 of them happen to be both a lion and a bear. So another connection here back to the story of David here in 1 Samuel 17. You're like, well, that's great. Why does that matter? Again, it's an allusion by Daniel from these dreams, both of Nebuchadnezzar and then Daniel's own dream, back to what God is foreshadowing here, what he ultimately intends to do in the story of David and Goliath, that God is going to bring redemption and deliverance from the existential threat that, of course, it seems to be the ones who are going to do Israel in, because nobody wants to fight. And the Philistines are only going to issue this challenge for so much longer before they decide nobody's brave enough to fight. And if Goliath is going to lead the armies out and nobody wants to face him individually, how much more formidable will he be if he's got a whole army coming after him? Well, all that to simply say that certainly the nations are quite formidable for exiled Judah and Israel, who have almost lost all sense of identity and unity as a nation. And even though they might be restored back to their own land, they're not going to have the might or superiority to be able to challenge a massive empire like Persia for their own freedom back. So all that to simply say, the connection here is to show what God's plan is, because David is the one who smashes the head of the serpent in this story fighting Goliath. He clearly becomes the most obvious candidate for the fulfillment of Hannah's words of God's king, his anointed one, his Messiah figure. And it's not long after this, we're talking literally a few verses in Daniel 7, right around 13 and 14, when the answer to this terrifying vision that strikes Daniel in such a way that he's looking for the answer of what this means, then he sees in a separate part of this vision, the heavenly court arrayed, God's throne surrounded by multiple thrones, and one who resembles a son of man who is rightly understood to be the messianic figure, the son of David, spoken of by all the major literary prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, as being the one who will be the leader in the messianic era of the restoration of God's people, who ascends on the clouds into God's presence to have a kingdom conferred upon him whose dominion and glory will never end. So both of these stories connect to David in that it's David living out the actual story of fighting Goliath, and it's a son of David who steps into the position of being the Son of Man who receives the never-ending kingdom, and the redemption and deliverance of God's people is secure by virtue of that in Daniel's story. Now, back to 1 Samuel chapter 11, switching gears here for just a second, just to look at how these lives and story arcs, at least to a point of progression in the lives of both Saul and David, are meant to be understood and appreciated by the reader. So back in 1 Samuel 11, Saul has already been anointed as king, and not only by Samuel in private, but he has been recognized as such by Lot in front of all of Israel, at least those who are represented that day when he was formally crowned as king and saluted by the people as king. Then after that, when Saul goes back to his own house, he hears the words that come across from the land of Gilead and the Jordan River to his own territory in Benjamin, that Nahash, now remember when we were talking about this back when this time happened, that Nahash is very structurally very similar to the word or the Hebrew three-letter base pair that forms the root words for both bronze and serpent. Nahash, Nehashtan, Nehoshet, various different words that are built off that three-letter base pairing that can describe bronze, shiny thing, bronzen, serpent. This word is structurally very similar to that, such that Nahash is a serpent figure in the story. Again, all the classic markers are there. He is the existential threat against God's people. He's coming to the people of Jabesh Gilead saying, I'm going to subjugate you. I'm going to pluck out the right eye of everybody in your territory. Go see if somebody can come and save you. Otherwise, 7 days, I'm going to be on your front doorstep popping out eyeballs. And then when Saul hears the news, he is overcome by the Spirit of the Lord, causing his anger to burn furiously. Then they, the army he raises, invade Ammonite territory, slaughter them. And of course, all the people then, after that, venerate Saul by proclaiming him king once again, but really making it super official at this point, right? Well, the same thing kind of happens with respect to David's story arc, as he now is brought into the limelight as this messianic figure, because the significance of Saul defeating the serpent figure of Nahash in 1 Samuel 11 puts him in the position of being the potential candidate to fulfill Hannah's words of being God's king and the one whose horn he will exalt as his anointed Messiah or Mashiach, right? But now that Saul has fallen from the picture, David becomes the next potential candidate. So his story progresses along the same track, because here we have the existential threat, not Nahash, but Goliath. So many different pointers have showed us that he is the serpent figure of the story, who comes out, standing out there every day in the Valley of Allah, saying, hey, this is what happens. If your man comes out here and beats me, then we will be your servants. But if I fight against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us. David comes out, stands as he's already been endowed with the Spirit of the Lord. In the previous chapter, he was anointed by Samuel. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him as he did Saul and was with him until the end of his days. He, in the Spirit of the Lord, power of the Lord, comes out and says, I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. And then, of course, after the defeat of Goliath, David is now the one who was venerated by people singing the song about David killing his tens of thousands compared to Saul's paltry thousands. So here we have something of Saul's story arc that is trending toward his crescendo, which has been the Nahash story, and then his sharp drop-off in chapters 13 and 15, which continue to go on beyond this. David will have something of a very similar meteoric rise up until what could have been his first summit right here, and then the downturning of his story. But instead, he not only successfully defeats the serpentine figure of Goliath, his Nahash. After that, he continues to ascend. After the defeat of Nahash by Saul, his story takes a sharp downward turn in the very close subsequent chapters. It's going to be off in the next volume of Samuel. So many chapters and many years that will transpire before we get to David's downturn. In fact, there will be another moment right around 1 Samuel 10 when David will face another serpentine figure in the story of the son of this particular figure, Nahash, his name being Hanun, and he becomes king in his father's stead after him, that David will ultimately defeat him. Again, a second serpentine figure in that. We'll talk about that here briefly in just a second. Then after that comes the events of 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel 11, and David's fall and sin with Bathsheba. So now to 1 Samuel 30, looking at more opportunities by which David is going to be seen as the serpent smasher. I'm going to cover these rather quickly. So David led them, and there were Amalekites spread out. Amalekites spread out all over the area, eating, drinking, celebrating, because of course they had plundered Ziklag, as we talked about last week. David slaughtered them from twilight until the evening of the next day, and roughly only 400 were able to escape, and not a single casualty was suffered by David and his men. But remember back in Exodus 17, as we alluded to just in recent past, that in the initial outset of battle between the Israelites and the Philistines, Moses encouraged Joshua, write this down, remember it from now on, and pass it on to the generation after you guys' generation eventually winds up dying out. That the Lord will be with war or be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. And remember, in the words of Moses in Numbers 24, the words of Balaam in Numbers 24, with his fourth and final oracle, he speaks of the kingdom of Israel and how his seed will be by abundant water. His king, which of course is alluding directly to David as the most prominent king in Israel's past, but ultimately that prophecy gives way to Jesus as its ultimate fulfillment. His king will be greater than Agag, a curious figure considering so many other kings might be considered greater than Agag, but Agag is the king of the Amalekites, which we of course learned from the narrative of Saul when he was given the task of annihilating the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15. And that of course this king of Israel will have a kingdom that will be exalted. So references here to the fact that Amalek will be at war as the seed of the serpent, a serpentine figure in this story, as Israel has just left Egypt now, and God was intending for them to avoid war by not sending them directly north, that would cause them to travel right underneath the kingdom of Philistia. Instead, the Amalekites come out as a threat to pick a fight with the Israelites in the wilderness, and God delivers the Amalekites into their hands. And with victory now comes this promise of intergenerational warfare that really doesn't quite pan out like that, but to say that this serpentine figure of Amalek will one day be squashed under the boot of Israel, and Israel's king, which is what Balaam was speaking of in Numbers 24. And here we have, even though there was a defeat of the Amalekites by Saul, yet it was done so disgracefully by the disobedience of God's command. There was no command put forth to David to completely annihilate the Amalekites, but nonetheless, he slaughtered many of them that day, and he did deliver a death-wielding blow of sorts to the head of this serpent in this part of the story. So that further connects him with the connotation of Genesis 3:15 as being the seed of the woman. All of this is meant by the author of 1 Samuel to show us that since Saul has failed to meet the criteria here or the expectations in the story of the serpent squasher, David has now become that prime candidate and is succeeding beyond just the initial fight with his first serpent, that being Goliath. Now on to 2 Samuel 8. So King David also dedicated to the Lord along with all the silver and gold he had dedicated from all the nations he had subdued. So at this point, we have a record of him fighting and engaging in battle all these various nations. Notice here, Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, Philistines, Amalekites, and the spoil of Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. was just a couple of weeks ago. We were there looking in the first chapters of Amos when the Lord was pronouncing judgment upon each one of these kingdoms, starting first with Damascus. And if you go back to read here in the context of 2 Samuel 8, Damascus is also listed as part of that because, of course, Hadadezer is the king of Damascus or Aram at this particular time. So anyway, punishing Damascus, he will not relent from punishing Gaza, he will not relent from punishing Edom, and on it goes. He lists every single one of these particular territories. I think it's beyond coincidence that here we have every one of these peoples that surround Israel being the very enemies that David was allowed to subdue and then thereby bring rest to Israel, albeit there's a slightly inverted picture with Amos because Amos is not predicting rest for Israel at the beginning of his oracles as he's pronouncing judgment on all their surrounding kingdoms. He's pronouncing on judgment on Israel right along with all of these kingdoms. But all of this to say that these people have continued to be seeds of the serpent, and God is speaking about their ultimate demise. David foreshadowed that by God allowing him to subjugate all these kingdoms, subdue them, bringing further order to the land outside of the territorial region of Israel, what could have ultimately give way to the expansion of Israel, maybe through some colonization, but certainly through the worship and influence of Yahweh in the land over generations of people in those territories coming to appreciate the wisdom of God's people by living amongst them, observing them, and of course, the blessing that Moses intended and pronounced upon these people. If you walk in the wisdom and light of God's counsel, these nations around you will see that you are wise and they will want to know more about the God you serve. Moving on to 2 Samuel 10, this is that moment where I'm alluding now to Hanun. Sometime later, the king of the Ammonites died. His son Hanun became king in his place. David said, I'll show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. Now, this must be perhaps a different Nahash. I can't say particularly that it is. It may very well be the very same Nahash who fought against Saul in that particular part of 1 Samuel. Either way, point being is that Hanun becomes a new existential threat to God's people because this is how he treats David and the emissaries he sent to him to console Hanun because he listens to his advisors and they say, hey, just because he's trying to console you, do you really think he's showing respect to your father? Instead, they have come to spy out the city so that they can prepare militarily, strategically to come lay siege to it, destroy it. So Hanun took David's emissaries and he doesn't kill them, but he gravely humiliates them by shaving off their hair or half their beards, cuts their clothes in half at the hips, and then sends them away, which launches a expansive battle campaign, I should say extensive battle campaign against Hanun and the ultimate defeat of the Ammonites right before we have David's fall or the fall aspect of his story. So all this to say, there are several things here to point to, many of which I have tried to do and perhaps only briefly winked at, but ultimately am covering in a rather generic way simply for the sake of us having a brief look at the parallels between Saul and David, all for the sake of seeing how David is a prospective messianic figure, but of course setting us up for what will come 2 weeks from now when we discuss the story of David's fall, the parallels between that and Saul as well, and answering the big question, which we already know the answer to, is David the actual messianic candidate? So David has lots of messianic qualities. And I will say, at least in the strictest sense of the Messiah being an anointed one, as Hannah describes him, and the term Mashiach being used in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10, to describe the king whose horn God will elevate or exalt, that we're looking for a Messiah figure. But it starts to feed into and create the theology of the Messiah, right? Because at this point, nobody is thinking about the Messiah, the one who will come as the seed of David. How can such a thing be when David hasn't even become king of Israel yet, right? So whatever anybody was thinking of, the concept of deliverer at this point was probably, most likely, I would say very confidently, seen strictly, if not exclusively, in the terms of Genesis 3:15 as the one who will ultimately end the seed of the serpent, who is that seed of the woman, right? And bring about deliverance for God's people. If deliverance was something that they were contemplating, and even if it was, I would say perhaps only in the sense of ending the enmity between God's people and the people of the serpent, whatever that may have meant to these ancient Jews at that time. We can see it from this side of the cross as clearly being the end of the grip of sin over us and our slavish obedience to it, such that now we have been freed. We have been released from our exile. We have now been brought into God's covenant family and all these wonderful things. But we have to be careful where we insert into that into the story of the Old Testament, not use that to recontextualize everything that was termed as deliverance or redemption for these ancient Israelites, because the theology of Messiah or various other things like that is on the horizon, but is in no way, shape, or form maturely developed at this point, if it's even considered to be in its stages of infancy. So there are plenty of gospel pictures in all of this for us, but all of this to simply say in my closing remarks, this is not a story about how we defeat our own giants. This is a story to show us who David is and ultimately what the agenda that the Lord has for him will be. And then to ask the question, as the tension is built in the story, is David the answer to Hannah's statement? And if he's not, why? And what does that mean for David as those implications come forward, as goes his fall and his removal from that position, him stepping out of the way for another candidate to take his place as the potential one who fulfills Hannah's words and the words that the Lord promises in Genesis 3:15. And of course, sets up the even more dramatic backdrop that we will see Jesus pass in front of with respect to the way he's described in the gospel narratives, right? So I know it's at times when I speak like this, it might create a concern in your mind. Well, then what is the point of reading this? If I read this story once and I understand that this is how the author is portraying David, is there no point of personal application in this for me? I wouldn't say that in the least bit. What I am saying, though, is that while there are pictures here that we can appreciate and maybe in some ways individually contextualize, as goes, here there's a battle that is won by faith. We understand there will always be, until the Lord returns, an existential threat against God's covenant family. And that, of course, is the ultimate adversary that we all face, who comes to us from the Genesis prologue and has been battling against God's people ever since, albeit in a limited fashion now, given the fact that he has been cast out of heaven. He is no longer given privy access to the divine court. Jesus spoke about this when he said he saw Satan fall from heaven as lightning. I believe that's even what John alludes to when he speaks of Satan being bound in the vision that is the apocalypse of Jesus Christ at the end of the Bible's canon itself, what we call the book of Revelation. More to come on that way in the future. But all that to simply say that we do have this existential threat that we must battle against and with every single day of our lives. And we battle him by faith, understanding that we have been given promises that we claim here and now. We are new creatures. We live in a new creation. We have the Spirit of God living within us. All these things to say that whatever Satan may attempt to try to do to sideline us, waylay us, or even subtly and in a very sultry fashion, tempt us, woo us, sway us to be defiantly rebellious against the Lord, he has no power or authority over us. He has been destroyed in a sense, but ultimately is pending his final and culminating defeat once the Lord does him in at his the last and final judgment. So we do fight battles, but we're not talking about slaying giants, especially when it comes to things like when someone is working against us at work. We've got a terrible coworker or even a boss who is working in some sort of tyrannical, villainous way against us to keep us down, to spread rumors about us in the office, or to paint us as bad people or whatever to our superiors, such that we won't get promoted where his buddies will. These are not giants that we face that we're waiting to be chopped down to size so that we can have the things that we think we rightly deserve. If that's what we're taking away from the story, we have sold it drastically short of its intended meaning. Instead, we are looking at it with the messianic connotations it has and appreciating the thrust of this story moving forward as it's seeking to answer the question of what happens, or how does God resolve the issue of what happened in the Garden of Eden. And as we're marching toward that, what is happening in the lives of these covenant partners that the Lord chooses to work with to advance that story. And ultimately, we appreciate its fulfillment in Jesus and how he has brought kingdom to earth, to the cosmos. And we, of course, find ourselves underneath the rule of God. So let's pray. Father, I thank you for this time. I thank you for perhaps the fresh insight that we may have received from this story. And ultimately, I pray, Lord, that you would please help expand our minds and hearts to appreciate what this story means and how we are to connect it to what has come before and ultimately what will come after it, as we appreciate the development of the themes of Messiah and Exodus and so many other important aspects to biblical theology. We ask this in your name, that again, you be glorified, and that we not just simply fill our heads with more knowledge, but that you help us to use this as being better disciples and, of course, disciple makers. In your name we pray.